In the grim darkness of the far future, where humanity clings to existence across 1,000,000 worlds, there are no greater heroes than those who ask for nothing more than the privilege to die in service to the Emperor. Among these countless souls, none embody this sacrifice more completely than the veterans of the Imperial Guard, men and women who have gazed into the abyss of galactic warfare and chosen to stand firm against the dying of the light. Sergeant Marius Cale adjusts his worn flak armor as the first pale rays of dawn pierce the perpetual smog of Mordian VII's industrial landscape. His movements carry the practiced efficiency of 3 decades spent in active combat zones across 17 different worlds. The Cadian shock troop insignia on his shoulder, barely visible through layers of grime and battle damage, marks him as one of the legendary Fortress World's sons, though Cadia itself fell to the 13th Black Crusade while he bled on distant battlefields. The trench line stretches endlessly in both directions, a festering wound carved across the planet's surface where Imperial forces have held against the forces of chaos for 873 consecutive days. Shell craters filled with stagnant water reflect the sickly light filtering through the chemical clouds above. Somewhere in the distance, artillery rumbles like the breathing of some massive, dying beast, a sound so constant that silence would now seem alien to those who call this hellscape home. Cale's weathered hands move with unconscious precision as he performs his morning ritual, checking his lasgun's charge pack, testing the weapon's sight alignment, examining his combat blade for any signs of corrosion. These actions, repeated thousands of times across countless dawns, serve as both practical necessity and psychological anchor. In a universe where madness lurks behind every shadow and death waits around every corner, routine becomes a form of prayer, a declaration that humanity endures. Behind him, the surviving members of 3rd Platoon begin to stir in their dugouts. Young faces, marked by the particular exhaustion that comes only from prolonged exposure to warfare, peer out into the perpetual twilight of no man's land. These are the newest replacements, fresh from the training worlds of Vostroyan Prime and Katachan, their equipment still bearing factory marks, their eyes not yet fully hollowed by the weight of what they have witnessed. In 6 months, if they survive, they will begin to understand. In a year, they might earn the right to call themselves guardsmen. In 5 years, should the Emperor will it, they might become the bedrock upon which humanity's defense rests. But Cale remembers when he possessed their innocence, when the universe seemed large enough to contain hope alongside horror. He was 17 years old when the Departamento Munitorum's tithe collectors arrived at his family's agricultural settlement on Talon Prime. The Adeptus Administratum's cold calculations had determined that young Marius possessed the physical and psychological profiles suitable for military service, and so he was gathered up along with 10,000 other souls from across the system's agri-worlds, processed through the vast bureaucratic machinery of imperial conscription, and shipped to the training facilities of distant Cadia. Cadia, the fortress world that stood sentinel against the Eye of Terror for 10 millennia, where every citizen was a soldier, and every soldier understood that their world represented the final barrier between humanity and the eternal damnation of chaos. There, beneath the malevolent glow of that cursed wound in reality, young Marius learned what it meant to serve. The Cadian doctrine was simple in its brutality: discipline, preparation, and the absolute certainty that duty transcended survival. The planet broke before the Guard did. Became more than a motto, it was a philosophical foundation upon which an entire existence could be built. The transformation from frightened farm boy to Imperial Guardsman did not happen overnight, nor was it accomplished through any single moment of revelation. Instead, it came through the slow accumulation of small deaths. In deaths, the death of the boy who had never seen violence, who believed in fairness and justice, who thought that courage meant the absence of fear rather than action despite terror. Each training exercise, each battlefield commission, each funeral for a fallen comrade, carved away another piece of innocence, until what remained was something harder, more focused, infinitely more dangerous. Cale's first taste of real combat came during the Severan Dominate campaign, where heretical Imperial Guard regiments had declared independence from the Imperium and allied themselves with Zeno's raiders. The irony was not lost on him. His first enemies wore uniforms nearly identical to his own, carried the same weapons, employed the same tactics he had been taught. But they had abandoned their oaths to the Emperor, and so they had forfeited their right to life. In the trenches and bunkers of Sepphoris Secundus, Marius learned that the greatest enemy of humanity was often humanity itself, corrupted and turned against its own kind. The young guardsman who emerged from that campaign understood something fundamental about the nature of imperial service. There were no innocent conflicts, no clean victories, no wars that could be won without staining one's soul. There was only duty, and the hope that by holding the line in this place and time, others might live to see another dawn. It was a lesson that would be reinforced across dozens of subsequent deployments, each more brutal than the last. On Valhalla's ice fields, he learned that cold could kill as surely as any enemy weapon, and that survival sometimes meant making choices that would haunt him for decades. When supply lines were cut during the siege of High Ferrograd, Kale's squad was forced to survive on rations stripped from frozen corpses, both imperial and enemy alike. The taste of desperation became as familiar as the weight of his lasgun, and he discovered that humans could adapt to circumstances that should have driven them insane. During the Armageddon Steel Legion's push against Orc forces on that blasted industrial world, he witnessed the staggering scale of warfare in the 41st millennium. Millions of soldiers locked in combat across continents, their individual lives reduced to statistical abstractions in the grand calculations of military planning. Yet it was also on Armageddon that Kale experienced his first real taste of victory, an XBUS, the sight of greenskin forces falling back before coordinated imperial assault, the knowledge that his regiment's sacrifice had contributed to something larger than mere survival. Each campaign added new scars, both visible and hidden. Shrapnel from an Orc rocket left jagged metal buried too deep in his shoulder for field medics to safely extract. A Chaos cultist's poison blade opened a wound across his ribs that never properly healed, aching with every change in atmospheric pressure. More dangerous were the psychological wounds, weary of watching his first squad leader die screaming in a minefield, the faces of civilian refugees he had been forced to abandon during the evacuation of Mordian III, the sound of his own voice giving orders that would send good soldiers to their deaths. But with each scar came knowledge, and with knowledge came the ability to keep others alive. Kale learned to read the subtle signs that preceded enemy attacks, the way birds fell silent before artillery strikes, how the air itself seemed to thicken before psychic assault, the particular quality of stillness that meant snipers had taken position. He developed an almost supernatural ability to sense weakness in enemy formations, to identify the precise moment when aggressive action could turn a losing battle into victory. More importantly, he learned how to lead men who were themselves learning these same harsh lessons. The transition from follower to leader came gradually, marked not by official promotion, but by the moment when younger soldiers began looking to him for guidance, when his opinions carried weight in tactical discussions, when his presence alone could steady a wavering battle line. Leadership in the Imperial Guard was not granted. Well fried, it was earned through the demonstration of competence under fire, the ability to make life and death decisions without hesitation, and the willingness to bear responsibility for the consequences of those choices. By the time Kale received his sergeant's stripes during the Ghoul Stars expedition, he had already been functioning as a squad leader for several years. The promotion simply acknowledged what his fellow guardsmen had long understood, and was that survival often depended on following the guidance of those who had lived long enough to accumulate wisdom. In the Imperial Guard, veteran status was not measured in years of service but in battles survived, wounds taken, and comrades saved through superior judgment and quick action. The daily routine of a veteran sergeant encompasses responsibilities that would have seemed overwhelming to the young conscript from Talon Prime. Before dawn, equipment inspection, not merely his own gear, but the weapons and armor of every soldier under his command. A lasgun with a cracked power cell could mean death not just for its wielder, but for his entire fire team. Flak armor with compromised seals might fail at the moment of greatest need. Combat knives, dulled by repeated use, required constant attention to maintain their killing edge. After equipment comes personnel inspection, ICA, checking each soldier for signs of illness, injury, or the subtle psychological deterioration that marked the onset of what medics euphemistically called battlefield fatigue. Kale had learned to recognize the ICA's warning signs, the 1,000-yard stare that indicated a mind withdrawing from unbearable reality, the tremor in hands that had seen too much killing, the particular form of silence that meant a soldier was contemplating actions that would harm both himself and his unit. Then came tactical briefings, poring over intelligence reports and terrain maps with company command staff, identifying potential weak points in defensive positions and optimal routes for patrol operations. The strategic situation on Mordian 7th had remained essentially static for over 2 years. Imperial forces held the planet's primary industrial centers, while Chaos cultists controlled the outer mining territories, with a no-man's land of devastated settlements marking the contested zone between them. But stability in war was always illusory. Enemy forces constantly probed Imperial lines, seeking weaknesses that could be exploited for major offensive operations. Every patrol report, every prisoner interrogation, every fragment of intercepted communications contributed to a larger picture that required constant analysis and adaptation. Veterans like Kale served as the living memory of their units, able to recognize patterns and anticipate enemy actions based on accumulated experience from dozens of similar conflicts. The weight of this responsibility manifested itself in ways both obvious and subtle. Kale's sleep, when it came at all, was frequently interrupted by nightmares, populated by the faces of soldiers who had died under his command, young men and women who had trusted his judgment and paid the ultimate price for decisions that seemed reasonable at the time, but proved tragically inadequate in retrospect. He carried detailed mental records of every casualty: Trooper Valdris, killed by sniper fire because Kale had chosen the wrong route for a reconnaissance patrol; Corporal Thane, lost to a booby trap that more careful advanced scouting might have detected; Private Kellis, who died holding a position that Kale should have recognized as untenable. These ghosts were the price of leadership, the burden that separated veterans from their younger comrades. Every successful mission, every enemy position overrun, every strategic objective secured was balanced against the knowledge that success in war was always purchased with blood. The mathematics were simple and brutal: acceptable losses, calculated risks, necessary sacrifices. But mathematics could not account for the human cost of making such calculations, the way each decision left its mark on those responsible for making them. Yet it was precisely this burden that made veterans like Kale invaluable to the Imperial war effort. Soldiers who had learned to function despite psychological trauma, who could make tactical decisions while carrying the weight of past failures, who understood that survival often required accepting losses that could not be prevented. These men and women became the backbone upon which entire campaigns depended. They possessed institutional knowledge that could not be taught in training academies or gleaned from tactical manuals. The breaking point came, as it inevitably must, during the largest Chaos assault on Mordian 7th since the initial invasion. Intelligence reports had indicated increased enemy activity in the northern sectors, but the scale and coordination of the attack caught Imperial forces off guard. Traitor Guard regiments supported by Chaos Space Marines struck simultaneously at 3 critical defensive positions, threatening to break through Imperial lines and reach the planet's primary munitions factories. In the confusion of the initial assault, communication networks failed and command structures collapsed. Junior officers found themselves cut off from higher authority, forced to make strategic decisions based on incomplete information and tactical instinct. It was in these moments that the true value of veteran leadership became apparent. Soldiers like Kale, who could assess rapidly changing battlefield conditions and adapt their responses accordingly, who possessed the moral authority to rally troops on the verge of panic and rout. The decision that would define Kale's legacy came when retreat orders filtered down through what remained of the communication network. Imperial High Command, recognizing that the northern defensive line could not hold against the sustained enemy assault, authorized a strategic withdrawal to secondary positions 30 kilometers to the rear. From a purely military perspective, the order made perfect sense. Menits preserve forces for a more defensible position rather than lose entire regiments in a futile last stand. But Kale's position overlooked the evacuation routes being used by civilian refugees fleeing the combat zone. Thousands of non-combatants, including children from the settlement of New Mordian, were streaming along roads that would become killing zones the moment Imperial forces withdrew, and enemy artillery could range freely across the territory. Following orders would mean abandoning these people to certain death. Refusing orders would mean condemning his own soldiers to fight a battle they could not win. The choice, when it came, surprised no one who had served under his command. Cale ordered his platoon to hold position and prepare defensive emplacements overlooking the evacuation routes. He sent a single Vox message to company headquarters, 3rd Platoon, holding present position to cover civilian withdrawal. Will hold until relief arrives or position becomes untenable. Then he switched off his communications array and turned his attention to the business of war. For 18 hours, 37 Imperial Guardsmen held a position that should have required a full company to defend. They faced wave after wave of chaos cultists, supported by artillery strikes and close air support, turning a relatively minor defensive position into a focal point for the entire battle. Ammunition ran low, then ran out entirely, forcing the defenders to rely on weapons stripped from enemy casualties. Medical supplies were exhausted within the first 6 hours, leaving wounded soldiers to fight with field dressings and stims as their only treatment. But the line held. Civilian evacuation convoys passed safely beneath their position, carrying 10,000 refugees to safety behind Imperial lines. By the time relief forces finally arrived, fewer than half of Cale's original force remained combat effective, and the sergeant himself had taken shrapnel wounds that would require months of recovery. But the mission had succeeded. The evacuation was complete. Enemy forces had been denied a critical strategic position, and Imperial morale had been boosted by a demonstration that even in the darkest circumstances, the Guard could be counted upon to hold the line. The aftermath brought official recognition, to instay, a commendation for valor, promotion recommendations, and the kind of attention from higher command that most sergeants spent their entire careers trying to avoid. But for Cale, the real measure of success lay in simpler metrics: letters from civilian families thanking him for their lives, younger soldiers seeking his guidance on matters of tactics and leadership, and the knowledge that when the moment of ultimate testing arrived, he had chosen duty over survival and found that choice validated by results. It was in this transformation that the true nature of Imperial Guard veterans became apparent. They were no longer simply soldiers following orders or fighting for survival. They had become something more fundamental to the Imperial war effort, living embodiments of the principles upon which human civilization rested. When regulations failed, when communications broke down, when higher authority was absent or compromised, veterans like Cale served as the moral and tactical backbone that prevented military collapse. This evolution from follower to leader, from survivor to guardian, represented more than simple career advancement. It marked the emergence of individuals who had internalized the larger purpose of Imperial military service, MPI, the understanding that their actions, however small in the context of galactic warfare, contributed to humanity's continued existence in a hostile universe. They fought not merely to win battles, but to preserve the possibility that future generations might live in a galaxy where human values could flourish. The ripple effects of veteran leadership extended far beyond individual combat actions. Soldiers trained under experienced sergeants carried forward lessons learned through decades of warfare, passing tactical knowledge and moral example to new generations of guardsmen. Battle-tested units became training cadres for fresh regiments, spreading institutional wisdom throughout the Imperial military structure. Veterans who survived to retirement often found themselves recruited as instructors in the Schola Progenium, where they shaped the education of future officers and commissars. But perhaps most importantly, veterans like Cale served as living proof that ordinary humans could face the horrors of the 41st millennium and emerge not merely intact but strengthened by the experience. In a galaxy where humanity was surrounded by hostile alien races, threatened by chaos, corruption, and constantly at war with itself, the existence of individuals who had confronted these challenges and chosen to continue fighting represented hope in its most practical form. From the perspective of Imperial military doctrine, veteran guardsmen occupied a unique position within the hierarchy of command. Commissars viewed them as exemplars of Imperial virtue, CDSA, soldiers who had proven their loyalty through years of service and demonstrated their competence through survival itself. They were less likely to require the kind of disciplinary intervention that marked interactions with newer recruits, more capable of self-regulation and peer leadership that reduced the burden on political officers. General Staff officers recognized veterans as force multipliers, ASA, individuals whose presence could significantly enhance the combat effectiveness of entire units. A single, experienced sergeant could transform a company of raw recruits into a functional fighting force, providing tactical guidance that prevented costly mistakes and tactical errors. Their knowledge of enemy capabilities, terrain conditions, and logistical requirements often proved more valuable than theoretical training received in military academies. For the civilian populations that Imperial forces were sworn to protect, veterans represented something approaching mythological status. These were the individuals who had faced the worst that the galaxy could offer and returned to tell the tale, living proof that humans could stand against impossible odds and prevail through courage and determination. Children on worlds touched by war grew up hearing stories of legendary guardsmen who had held impossible positions, completed suicide missions, and sacrificed everything for the greater good of humanity. Yet this veneration also carried its own burden. Veterans found themselves isolated by their experiences, unable to relate to civilians who had never witnessed the true horror of galactic warfare, equally distant from newer soldiers who had not yet fully understood the price of military service. They existed in a psychological space between worlds, no longer truly civilian, but somehow separate from the ordinary experience of military life. The loneliness of command was compounded by the knowledge that their expertise came at a price that could never be fully repaid. Every tactical insight had been purchased with blood, every lesson learned through watching good soldiers die, every moment of competence built upon a foundation of loss and sacrifice that younger generations could not fully comprehend. Veterans carried the institutional memory of their units, but they also bore witness to all the failures, mistakes, and tragedies that had shaped that memory. In the final analysis, what made Imperial Guard veterans truly exceptional was not their physical capabilities or technical expertise, though both were considerable. Instead, it was their psychological resilience, 2025, the ability to function effectively, despite trauma, to make rational decisions while carrying emotional burdens that would cripple lesser individuals, and to continue serving even when personal cost had long since exceeded any reasonable expectation of reward. They represented the best of humanity not through genetic enhancement or psychic power, but through the demonstration of moral courage in circumstances that tested the limits of human endurance. In a galaxy where superhuman space marines and psychically gifted individuals often dominated military operations, veterans like Kale proved that ordinary humans could achieve extraordinary things through discipline, determination, and an unwavering commitment to duty. As Sergeant Marius Kale watches another dawn break over the trenches of Mordian the Seven, he understands that his war will never truly end. Even if this particular campaign concludes successfully, there will always be another world under threat, another enemy to face, another line that must be held at all costs. The mathematics of Imperial military service are simple and brutal. In T6, there are never enough soldiers, never sufficient resources, never adequate time to properly prepare for the challenges ahead. But there are veterans, scattered across 1,000,000 worlds, standing watch in the darkness and holding fast against the dying of the light. They are men and women who have gazed into the abyss of galactic warfare and chosen to build their lives around the principle that some things are worth dying for. In the end, they are just humans with lasguns, flak armor, and an unshakable conviction that duty transcends survival. And sometimes, in the grim darkness of the far future, that is enough.